Granite Point, Maine, November 1891. The quarry had already gone quiet for the evening when the strangest sound on the hill kept going. Ping, scrape, ping. Not the fast iron music of a paid crew. Not the heavy crash of men splitting blocks for curbstone. This was slower, more stubborn. One blow, one twist of the drill, one breath. At the edge of the quarry road, Righty and Price stood alone in front of a glacial boulder, so large the teamsters used it as a landmark. It rose out of the spruce like the back of a stranded whale, 42 feet from end to end. Hard gray granite, left there by ice before any human hand had named the coast. Ridian was drilling into it, not to split it, not to quarry it, to move his family inside. The men coming down from the ledges stopped in the road to watch him work. Caleb Winslow, the yard boss, leaned on his measuring staff with the irritated patience of a man watching good labor wasted. Beside him stood Orrin Pratt, the carpenter, who had raised half the new shacks in the settlement, and Moses Bell, whose oxen could drag a 10-ton stone sledge through mud without complaint. Orrin laughed first. "A man can sleep in a barn, a boat, or a bad cabin," he said, "but I have not yet seen a sane man rent a room from a rock." Moses spat into the frozen ruts. "He says the stone will keep him warm." That made Caleb Winslow straighten. Caleb knew granite. He knew how water moved through hidden seams. He knew what winter did when it found a hairline crack. He watched Ridian pack a tiny charge into the hand-drilled hole, no bigger than a thumb, then seal it with clay. "That boulder will not keep him warm," Caleb said. "It will keep his coffin dry until the first freeze. Then the ice will open it like a clamshell." The men nodded, because every man on that hill understood the same rule. Stone was cold, wood was shelter, fire was warmth. Righty and Price had taken those three obvious truths and refused all of them. By January, Caleb expected to find the great boulder split, the doorway ruined, and Ridian's experiment buried under ice. Instead, in the deadest part of the deadest cold that winter, Caleb Winslow would place his bare hand on the outside of that stone and feel heat coming through it. Not smoke, not flame, stored heat, a memory of fire held inside a mountain. Righty and Price had not come to Maine to prove a principle. He had come because the slate work in North Wales had starved too many careful men. In Blaenau Festiniog, his father had taught him to read rock before he could read a printed page. A good stone spoke in pressure, grain, and sound. A bad one lied until the moment it killed you. By the time Ridian crossed the Atlantic with his wife Ellen and their two children, Sion and little Owain, he had spent 20 years underground and in open pits. He knew the difference between breaking stone and persuading it. He knew where a seam would travel before the seam itself became visible. He knew that a blast could be a hammer, or it could be a whisper. The quarry owners at Granite Point liked men like him. They were quiet, exact, and difficult to frighten. What they did not give him was a house. Like the other new families, the Prices rented a plank-walled shack near the cart road. It had a stove, a table, one bed, 2 straw ticks, and walls thin enough for the wind to search them with fingers. Their first winter was not merely cold. It was instructional. On the first night below zero, Ellen found the dishcloth frozen stiff against a nail beside the stove. In December, the water bucket formed a lid of ice, so thick Ridian had to crack it with a stove poker before breakfast. The children learned to dress under blankets. Sion's toes swelled purple with chilblains. Owain developed a cough that made his small ribs jump under his nightshirt. Rydian fed the stove until the iron plates glowed dull red. Still the heat vanished. It climbed into the rafters. It slipped through board joints. It was stolen at the floor by every draft that came under the door. The stove made heat fiercely, but the house held almost none of it. That was the failure nobody named. The cabins were not weak because the men were lazy. Orrin Pratt's frames were square. His joints were tight by the standards of the coast. The problem was not workmanship. The problem was storage. A plank cabin is like a tin cup held over a flame. It warms quickly. Remove the flame, and it cools almost at once. A heavy stone is different. It is more like the iron top of an old cook stove. Slow to warm, slow to cool. It does not give comfort instantly, but once heat enters it, the heat does not leave in a hurry. Rydian had known this underground. Deep rock did not care about the day's weather. In the old Welsh workings, the air stayed stubbornly steady while storms tore over the mountain above. Rock moved heat slowly. It swallowed change and released it by inches. So while other men searched for better stovepipe, thicker quilts, and cheaper cordwood, Rydian searched for mass. That was when he chose the whaleback Boulder. It sat on the north rise above the settlement, partly buried in frozen moss, its surface silvered by lichen and salt wind. The quarrymen had ignored it for years because it was awkward stone, too rounded for clean commercial blocks, too far from the derrick, too big to move without foolish expense. Rydian saw something else, a shell. Not a wall built around a room, but a room waiting inside a wall. He began in September, before the first hard frost. He did not bring a crew. He did not bring the steam drill. He brought hand steel, a sledge, wedges, clay, black powder, and a patience that made other men restless just standing near it. Each evening, after paid work, he marked the stone with charcoal. Then he drilled shallow angled holes in a low crescent where the doorway would be. He struck, turned the steel a fraction, struck again, and listened. The sound changed when the bit crossed quartz. It changed when a hidden seam accepted the pressure. It changed when the stone was about to release. The first charge did not explode like a quarry shot. It gave a short, muffled cough. When the smoke cleared, a plate of granite had loosened from the face. Rydian carried it away in a barrow. The next night he did it again and again. Slowly a mouth appeared in the boulder, then a narrow throat, then a chamber. The men called it Price's burrow. Orrin Pratt said the children would grow pale as mushrooms. Moses Bell said Rydian would learn the difference between a mine and a home when the roof sweated on his supper. Caleb Winslow had a more serious objection. In October, he stepped inside the half-made chamber with a lantern and ran his palm across the rough interior. The walls were scalloped from tiny releases, not shattered, but Caleb did not trust what he could not see. "You have bruised it," he said. Rydian brushed granite dust from his sleeves. "I have opened it. You have cracked it. I have listened to it." Caleb lifted the lantern toward the low ceiling. "Water will find every mistake you made. Then frost will finish the argument." Rydian did not answer at once. He put one hand on the stone as if feeling for a pulse. "Only if I ask the stone to do what it does not want to do." That was the closest thing to an argument he offered. By late November, the room was large enough for the family. Rydian had left no thin skin anywhere. 4.5 feet of granite remained around the chamber on the narrowest side, more in other places. The ceiling arched low and heavy. The floor was chipped flat. then covered with planks raised on short blocks so feet did not rest directly on stone. He cut a doorway small enough to kneel through, then built a thick oak door with a leather gasket nailed around the edge. He found a natural rising seam and widened it carefully into a flue for a squat iron stove. A single small vent near the entry gave the stove its draft without letting the whole chamber breathe like a sieve. It was not pretty. There were no windows. The walls were gray, rough, and close. Candlelight struck flakes of mica and made the inside sparkle in small secret points. Ellen hung a white cloth near the bed to brighten the room. Rydian built shelves into the stone and set the stove near the center, not against a wall, because he wanted the heat to reach everything. He was not building a cave. He was charging a battery. The numbers make the idea less strange. Dry pine and spruce have some insulating value, but they are light. They do not store much heat in the volume of a wall. Granite is not magical, and by itself it is not a perfect insulator, but it is dense, roughly 5 times heavier than many building woods by the same volume. Even though wood can hold heat well for its weight, the stone's sheer mass changes the equation. Rydian's chamber was about 16 feet across at its widest point. Around it sat hundreds of tons of granite. That meant every hour the stove burned, the room was not only warming the air, it was pushing energy into the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. At first, the stone drank heat greedily. The air felt cool because the granite was stealing comfort from it. But after days of steady use, the inner surface of the boulder rose to a mild, stable warmth. Then came the trick no planksha could perform. When the fire died, the heat did not vanish. It came back. Slowly, evenly, from every side the stove gave heat like a shout. The granite returned it like a long breath. Most of the settlement did not believe this. They saw only a family moving into a windowless stone pocket in December, and assumed desperation had become foolishness. Then the weather turned. It began with rain from a dark sea wind. For 2 days, water fell on ground already locked by frost. It glazed every fence rail, every spruce needle, every rope on the derricks. Ox chains froze into rigid curves. Men had to strike wagon pins with hammers to free them. By the 3rd morning, the world looked carved from glass. Then the wind shifted north. The temperature fell so fast the quarry pond sang under its new ice. By midnight, it was 14 below. Before dawn, 26 below. At sunrise, Caleb Winslow's thermometer on the cookhouse wall read 29 below zero, and the ink in the ledger room had thickened in its bottle. Inside the plank houses, stoves roared, and still the cold won ground. At Orrin Pratt's cabin, frost grew on the nail heads. His wife kept the children in bed under coats because the floor felt like iron. A pan of wash water froze in a corner 6 feet from the stove. Smoke backed down the chimney when gusts slammed the roof. Every hour Orrin fed the fire, and every hour the house demanded more. At the Price's Boulder, there had been no fire since late evening. Ellen woke before dawn, not because she was cold, but because she expected to be. The room was dim. The stove held only ash and one buried coal. The children were asleep with their hands outside the blankets. No frost coated the door. No white feathers grew on the shelves. A heel of bread on the table was still soft enough to press with a thumb. Rydian checked the small thermometer he had borrowed from the tool house. 62 degrees. Outside, the air was cold enough to burn skin. Inside, butter could soften on a plate. That was the proof Ellen trusted more than any number. Not a theory, not a proud speech. Soft butter, sleeping children. A kettle that did not freeze before morning. The stone had taken the day's modest fire and returned it through the long black hours when other homes were burning cordwood like fear. The discovery might have stayed a family secret if the storm had not damaged the quarry. On the fourth day, a derrick cable snapped under ice load and dropped a boom across the upper track. No one was killed, but the next crew could not be allowed near the ledge until the rigging was marked and the cracked blocks above it inspected. Caleb Winslow went up after dusk with a lantern, chalk, and a temper sharpened by cold. The hill was silent except for his boots grinding over crusted snow. His scarf froze where his breath touched it. The lantern glass smoked at the edges. Ice on the spruces clicked in the wind like hundreds of small teeth. On his way down, he passed the whaleback boulder. He expected to feel satisfied. He had predicted failure, and this was the weather that should have exposed it. If the stone had cracked, if the doorway had sagged, if the flue had iced shut, he would see it now. But the boulder stood whole, dark, silent. Then Caleb saw the ground. On the south side of the stone, where snow should have piled deep against the base, there was a bare crescent of wet gravel, 10 feet wide. Steam lifted from it in thin threads that vanished in the moonlight. Caleb stopped. A spring was impossible. Every spring on the hill was sealed under ice. A buried fire would have smoked. A leak from the stove would have blackened the stone. This was different. The heat was coming through the granite. Not much. Not enough to blaze. Not enough to burn a hand. But enough to push back a Maine January. Caleb walked to the boulder and removed his mitten. He hesitated because his whole life had taught him what frozen granite should feel like. Then he pressed his palm to the stone. It was warm. Not warm like a stove. Not even warm like a brick beside a hearth. Warm like something alive after sleep. A deep, quiet warmth held under the surface, as if the rock remembered every fire Ridian had burned and was giving them back one at a time. Caleb left his hand there longer than he meant to. The man who had measured stone all his adult life had mistaken it for a dead thing. Ridian had treated it as a slow thing. That was the difference. The next morning, Caleb did not make a speech. Men like Caleb Winslow did not surrender loudly. He simply told the crew not to call it Price's Burrow anymore. Call it what it is, he said. A warm house. That was enough. Curiosity replaced laughter. Men who had joked in September now came after shift to stand inside the chamber and feel the steady air. Their first surprise was not the warmth. It was the absence of struggle. There was no blast of heat from a roaring stove, no cold draft crawling under the door, no corner where breath turned white, just steadiness. Ridian explained it in the language he had. Heat goes into the stone slowly. Heat leaves the stone slowly. Do not try to rush it. Do not carve too thin. Do not split the roof from pride. Let the rock keep its strength, and it will lend you its patience. Some men heard peasant superstition. The stonecutters heard technique. They asked where to angle the first drill holes, how to read a seam that might carry water, how much wall to leave around a stove flue, how many hours of low fire it took before the room settled. Ridian answered plainly. Before spring, 2 more families were studying boulders and ledges on their small plots, not as obstacles but as possible shelter. Most never built anything as extreme as Ridian's house. It required the right stone, the right skill, and a tolerance for darkness many people did not have. But the idea traveled farther than the boulder itself. Heavy masonry around a stove. Stone floors that could catch daytime heat. Earth-sheltered rooms that did not chase every weather swing. Walls that were not only barriers, but reservoirs. Modern builders would later give clean names to these principles: thermal mass, heat capacity, airtightness, passive stability. They would draw diagrams, run calculations, and rediscover what one stone worker had learned with his hands. Comfort is not only made by producing heat. Comfort is made by keeping heat from becoming panic. Radian Price did not conquer winter. That is too simple. He did something quieter and more difficult. He stopped treating the cold as an enemy that had to be fought every hour with more fuel. He changed the battlefield. He placed his family inside a mass so large and slow that winter could no longer rush the room. The quarrymen had seen a man attacking a boulder, but Radian had seen a different question. Not, how do I build a house against the cold, but what if the cold has to get through a mountain first? That was his genius. Not fire, not stone. The patience between them.